Welcome to this explainer. Today, we are unpacking what is easily one of history's greatest accidental discoveries, the Dead Sea Scrolls. And look, this isn't just some dry, dusty history lesson. This is a full-blown archaeological thriller. We're talking ancient secrets, literally priceless artifacts, and a frantic race against time that completely reshaped our understanding of the ancient world. Let's dive right in.
All right, I want you to picture this. It's 1947. We're in the rugged, sun-scorched cliffs of Qumran, right near the Dead Sea. A Bedouin shepherd named Mohammed Ed-Dib is just out wandering the rocky terrain. He casually tosses a stray rock into a dark, narrow cave opening. But instead of a dull thud against the dirt, he hears this unmistakable, sharp sound of shattering pottery. That single echoing crack in the desert? Yeah, that would end up echoing through the entire historical and scientific world, kicking off our whole story.
So what did the shepherd actually find? He found ancient, weathered leather scrolls, carefully wrapped in linen. But he had absolutely no idea what their historical worth was. $150. That is literally all it cost for Metropolitan Samuel of St. Mark's Monastery to purchase these artifacts after they were dragged down to a local market in Bethlehem. Just $150 for what we now consider priceless treasures of human history. The staggering difference in value there is it's mind-blowing.
Now this kicked off an incredibly tense handoff. On one side, you have religious figures like Metropolitan Samuel, who firmly believed in the antiquity of the scrolls, but was facing intense skepticism from early critics. People were doubting him, so the academic world steps in. Samuel reached out to scholars, including Professor Sukenik of the Hebrew University and Dr. John Trevor at the American School of Oriental Research. This was a super tense period of authentication. Imagine these incredibly delicate documents passing from the harsh desert to antique dealers, to monks, and finally ending up under the intense magnifying glasses of academic experts.
Okay, so here's where the plot really thickens. While examining the scripts on these newly found texts, specifically an Isaiah scroll, Dr. Trevor noticed a striking similarity in the handwriting to something called the Nash Papyrus. Now, up until that exact moment, the Nash Papyrus was widely recognized as the absolute oldest known Hebrew text in existence. Trevor's heart must have been pounding out of his chest when he realized these new scrolls didn't just match the Nash Papyrus, they might actually predate it.
I mean, what do you do when you think you've just found the oldest text in history? You call in the top guy. Dr. Trevor rushed photographs of the scrolls over to Dr. William Albright in the United States. On March 15, 1948, Albright wrote back, and he was absolutely astounded. He definitively validated the find, confirming they were indeed older than the Nash Papyrus. It was this massive eureka moment that sent shockwaves through the global scientific community. But this realization also triggered an immediate, terrifying crisis. If there were incredibly valuable ancient scrolls sitting in one random cave, were there more? And, more importantly, could the archaeologists get to them before local looters destroyed the evidence?
Part 1. The Race to Cave 1.
So, to find and secure the original cave site, an official expedition, prominently led by Father Roland DeVoe, was hastily thrown together in early 1949. But when the team finally reached Cave 1, their hearts just sank. As you might guess from the story so far, the cave had been heavily looted, massive disruption to the site. But, and this is why archaeological persistence totally pays off, the team successfully recovered what the looters had left behind. They painstakingly sifted through the debris and found hundreds of small parchment fragments, ancient linen wrappers, Roman lamps, and broken pottery. These physical items were absolutely critical because they definitively proved the authentic, ancient origins of the scrolls that Metropolitan Samuel had bought. What started as a search of a single cave quickly turned into an all-out archaeological sweep across the entire Qumran cliff face. 1949 gives us Cave 1, sure, but the search just exploded from there, turning into this highly competitive, massive treasure hunt. In February 1952, Cave 2 is found. Then, in September 1952, the monumental discovery of Cave 4. And it just kept going. You had international scientists and Bedouin tribes scouring the desert all the way up to Cave 11 in 1956.
Now, I really want to pause on that September 1952 date for a second. Cave 4 is often called the Mother Lode, and for very good reason. When Father DeVos and scholar J.T. Millick finally pinpointed this specific cave, which was located right near the Qumran ruins, it completely changed the game. It yielded a staggering treasure trove. We are talking about tens of thousands of scroll fragments, which experts had to puzzle together to form hundreds of different manuscripts. It completely changed the scale of the Dead Sea Scrolls discovery, cementing it as one of the most vital historical finds ever.
And here's a crazy detail. Not all the scrolls were made of animal skin or papyrus.
As this multi-year exploration went on, the teams found some incredibly unique variations. For example, in Cave 3, they discovered the mysterious copper scroll. Unlike the religious parchment texts, this one was etched directly into thin sheets of copper, and it reads almost like an ancient treasure map, literally listing locations of hidden gold and silver. It just goes to show the incredible diversity of what was being protected in these desert vaults. Okay, so we have the scrolls, we have the caves, but how do we definitively know exactly how old they are?
Part 2. The science of dating the texts.
The global scientific community had to work meticulously and objectively to prove the timeline beyond a shadow of a doubt. The very first step? The pottery. The scrolls were found carefully preserved inside these really specific, tall, cylindrical jars. Dr. Albright and other experts analyzed the unique style and the clay of these exact jars. Based on that typological analysis, they placed their creation solidly in the Hellenistic to early Roman period, so specifically between the late 1st century BC and the early 1st century AD. But of course, the science didn't stop at the jars.
3 distinct scientific methods ended up converging perfectly to build an undeniable case. First, experts like Dr. Libby used the then newly invented radiocarbon dating method on the linen wrappers that enclosed the scrolls. The result? Late 2nd century BC. Second, you have paleography, which is the study of ancient handwriting, and that matched that exact same era. And third, the pottery analysis we just talked about aligned perfectly with the other two. The physical science locked in the timeline, proving beyond a doubt that these were authentic texts from the Second Temple period. So, what is the crucial point to take away from all this? Basically, a single, randomly thrown rock unveiled a lost library that had somehow survived for 2 millennia in the arid dark of the desert. From a literal $150 market trade all the way to the highest levels of radiocarbon science, the Dead Sea Scrolls fundamentally reshaped our understanding of history. But, I want to leave you with a sense of wonder here. The Judean desert is incredibly vast. If a wandering shepherd could accidentally stumble upon the greatest archaeological find of the 20th century, what other monumental history might still be out there, buried under the sands, just waiting to be found? Thank you so much for exploring this fascinating journey with me. Stay curious and keep learning.
Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving into what is literally an archaeological detective story, the science behind dating the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Qumran ruins. Have you ever wondered how historians can look at a crumbling piece of parchment and just confidently declare exactly when it was written? Well, today we're unpacking the incredible forensic science, from geology right through to chemistry, that unlocked one of the greatest historical puzzles of the 20th century. So here's our central mystery. How exactly do scientists determine the real age of artifacts that have been sitting in desert caves for over 2,000 years? It's not just guesswork, right? It takes a highly rigorous, multidisciplinary approach. Think of it like a modern crime scene investigation, where every single piece of physical evidence has to cross-verify all the others to build an undeniable case. To crack this case, we're going to use a brilliant scientific toolkit. We'll be looking at the mystery of place and time, the testimony of ancient coins, a massive earthquake in 31 BC, carbon-14 testing, and finally the evolution of ancient scripts and letters. All right, let's get right into it. Starting off with Part 1, the mystery of place and time, and reading the ruins of Khirbet Qumran. The physical ruins themselves are actually our very first clue. When you look at the lowest rock layers, specifically the size and style of the masonry, they point to a human presence way back in the 8th to 6th centuries BC. Now that lines up perfectly with historical records of ancient Judean kings building towers out in the wilderness. But, well, knowing the site is ancient is great, but we really need to narrow down the timeline to find our specific scroll writers. Which brings us to Part 2, the testimony of ancient coins, and building an unbroken chain of history. During excavations, researchers hit the absolute jackpot. They unearthed a massive treasure trove of ancient coins, including this breathtaking secret stash of 550 silver pieces from Tyre, all carefully hidden in clay jars under a floor. Think about it like this. If you find one single Ottoman gold lira in modern-day Lebanon, it doesn't mean the Ottoman Empire is still running things today, it's just a keepsake. But if you find a massive, diverse accumulation of coins from a specific era in one spot, that acts as undeniable proof of an active, thriving settlement during that exact time period. And that logic perfectly matches what they found at Qumran.
By tracking the sheer abundance of coins, excavators basically mapped out an unbroken chain of human habitation. I mean, we're seeing coins from John Hyrcanus around 130 BC, a really heavy concentration from Alexander Jannaeus in 76 BC, going right up to the First Roman Revolt in 67 AD. It's quite literally a financial map of the community's daily life. Moving on to part 3, the 31 BC earthquake. This is nature's geological timestamp.
Now, here is where things get super interesting. While investigators were mapping out that coin record, they noticed a highly suspicious gap right around the reign of King Herod the Great. Why'd a gap? Well, look at these violently cracked foundations and broken cisterns. Historical records tell us a massive earthquake hit ancient Judea in 31 BC. The ruins show that this quake was so violent, it actually sheared the water cisterns in half. It literally dropped one side down by a full 50 centimeters. So this terrifying natural disaster perfectly explains the sudden break in our coin timeline. The sheer destruction kept everyone away for about 25 years. They didn't even come back to repair the walls until a quarter of a century later, right as the Roman era began. This earthquake acts as an unforgeable timestamp, perfectly aligning the physical ruins with known history. All right, part 4, carbon-14 isotope testing, where chemistry enters the investigation. Okay, so we've got dates for the ruins, but what about the scrolls themselves? When they were discovered in the caves, a lot of them were carefully preserved in linen wrappers. That organic material is our smoking gun. Carbon-14 isotope testing is a method that measures the decay of radioactive carbon in organic stuff. Because those linen wrappers were made from flax plants, scientists can measure the remaining carbon-14 to figure out exactly when that plant was harvested, essentially pinpointing the exact moment it stopped breathing in carbon from the atmosphere. And the results are amazing. When scientists tested the linen wrappers, the chemistry dictated they were made between 167 BC and 233 AD. Now, when you compare that scientific date range with the historically accepted abandonment of Qumran around 68 to 70 AD, the scientific data and the historical records line up flawlessly. The chemistry totally confirms the history. Finally, part 5, the evolution of scripts and letters, looking at the linguistic fingerprint of paleography. Let's see how all this builds to a visual climax. Take a look at the changing shape of the Hebrew letter meme across different historical eras. Just like fashion or architecture, the way scribes drew their letters changed over time. Are the lines straight? Are they curved? Does the letter hang below the line? These subtle little shifts act exactly like a linguistic fingerprint. To decode this fingerprint, researchers use a strict 3-step logic. First, they find a text with a firmly established, unquestionable date. Second, they meticulously studied the specific letter shapes in that dated text. And finally, they compare those shapes against the undated Dead Sea Scrolls. By applying this logic, scholars definitively proved the scroll's handwriting matched precisely to the era between 300 BC and 68 to 70 AD. But wait, it gets better. The forensic science didn't stop at just the shapes of the letters. They actually tested the ink itself. Experts proved the ink on the scrolls was incredibly unique. Instead of the common, corrosive metallic inks everyone else used back then, the Qumran scribes used a mix of pure commercial carbon, water, and a gummy substance. And guess what? When archaeologists excavated the ruins, they found ancient inkwells containing dried residue of that exact same non-metallic carbon mixture. Seriously, what are the odds? So let's look at the whole shebang here. The lowest stones give us 8th century BC roots. The coin hoards map out an unbroken chain of daily life. That massive 31 BC earthquake perfectly explains the 25-year gap in habitation. Carbon-14 chemistry solidly dates the linen wrappers. And paleography, paired with the chemical ink analysis, links the handwriting directly back to the settlement. When you layer geology, chemistry, history, and linguistics together, the complete, undeniable timeline of the Dead Sea Scrolls is finally decoded. It is absolutely wild what happens when different branches of science team up to solve one historical mystery, isn't it? As we close this explainer, seeing just how thoroughly these ancient fragments have been authenticated, it leaves us with such a thrilling thought. What other ancient secrets are out there, buried deep in the sand, just waiting for the right science to bring them out into the light? Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive, and keep your curiosity alive.
Welcome to this visual explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a massive historical detective story. We're heading back in time to explore the ancient Qumran community.
If you've ever been totally captivated by the idea of secret societies, hidden texts, and just radical lifestyles, well, you are absolutely in the right place. Let's break down the rich history and the sheer mystery surrounding these enigmatic people.
Okay, let's dive into this. Just picture the scene for a second. You've got this young shepherd, Muhammad Adabib, out searching for a lost goat among these harsh, craggy rocks right near the Dead Sea. He tosses a stone into this dark cave opening, and instead of a bleeding goat, he hears the unmistakable sound of breaking pottery. What he stumbled upon inside those ancient jars turned out to be the very first of the Dead Sea Scrolls. I mean, this chance discovery literally blew the lid off one of the greatest archaeological enigmas in human history.
But, this incredible discovery immediately begs a massive question, and it's one I really want you to think about right now. Who were the people who completely walked away from civilization, who abandoned the known world to painstakingly write and then hide these scrolls out in the middle of a barren desert? Well, to figure that out, we've got to look at a group of people known as the Essenes.
Part 1. Ancient Witnesses Speak. To piece together this giant puzzle, we can't just look at the physical ruins of Qumran. We're actually going to call to the stand two ancient historical reporters from the 1st century who documented this bizarre, isolated lifestyle, the Roman author Pliny the Elder and the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus. Let's see what they actually had to say.
So Pliny the Elder was just utterly fascinated by them. He wrote that they lived without women, they completely avoided money, and lived out among the palm trees. But here is the wildest part. He marvels at how they survived for ages without a single person actually being born into their community. Like, how does that even work? Well, because they were constantly replenished by a steady stream of new recruits. Basically, people who were completely exhausted by the turbulent sea of life and just needed to seek refuge out in the desert.
And then we have Flavius Josephus. He categorized the Jewish philosophies of his day into 3 main sects: the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. And he noted that the Essenes really set themselves apart through this extreme mutual devotion, like a super deep affection for one another, and an incredibly rigid, extraordinary fear of God. These guys weren't just some casual religious group. They were deeply, radically committed to their brotherhood.
Part 2. The ascetic life. So, okay, we know they were devoted, and we know they were isolated. But what did a normal Tuesday actually look like for an Essene? We're going to look a bit closer at the intense daily grind of this community to really grasp their isolated reality.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is just how intensely regimented their entire existence was. Every single day followed this strict, almost military-level precision. Step 1, they're up before the sun, right? Not uttering a single word about worldly matters, just reciting ancestral prayers as if they're physically urging the sun to rise. Step 2, intense labor. They worked at their assigned crafts or out in the fields until the 5th hour. Step 3, they gathered together, put on these white veils, and bathed in freezing cold water just to purify themselves. And finally, step 4, completely purified, they'd walk into their dining hall in absolute pin-drop silence, treating the room like it was a literal holy temple, all to share a sacred communal meal. Talk about a life of ultimate discipline.
But here's the thing, you couldn't just knock on the door and join the club. I really want you to put yourself in their shoes and imagine enduring this completely grueling initiation process just to become an Essene. First off, you wait outside the community for a full year, and they give you nothing but a small axe and a white robe. If you somehow show enough self-control, okay, you're allowed to share their purifying waters, but get this, you still can't even eat with them. You have to endure 2 more years of intense character testing. Only then, if you're deemed worthy, do you swear this massive, life-altering oath to love truth, hate wickedness, never abuse power, completely avoid luxury, and above all, protect the community's secrets with your actual life. It took an unbelievable amount of willpower just to be accepted.
Let's see how all this discipline builds into this really incredible historical anecdote recorded by Josephus. See, the Essenes were highly respected for their prophetic gifts. Josephus actually tells this crazy story about an Essene named Menahem who spotted a young boy just walking to school. Menahem greets this kid as the future king of the Jews. Now, this boy had absolutely zero royal prospects at the time, but his name? Herod. When Herod the Great actually did become king years later, he totally remembered Menahem's prophecy. And because of that, King Herod held the Essenes in incredibly high regard, even exempting them from certain loyalties that were strictly required of everyone else.
Part 3. The Maccabean Rebellion. Now this brings up a massive, glaring question. These people were clearly respected, right? Even by kings. So why flee? Why put yourself through that brutal initiation and live out in the unforgiving desert?
Well, to answer that, we've got to zoom out from the micro view of their peaceful existence and look at the macro view of the absolute political chaos going on around them.
So the really crucial point to grasp here is the sheer overwhelming violence of the era. If we trace the timeline back to the Seleucid rule, the Jewish people were heavily oppressed and violently forced to worship idols. The breaking point? It happened in a small town called Modian. A priest named Matthedius watched a Jewish man step up to an altar to offer an idol sacrifice. And Matthedius just snapped. He assassinated both the compromising man and the king's official right there on the altar. He and his sons then immediately fled into the mountains, which sparked the incredibly bloody Maccabean revolt that completely engulfed Judea in warfare from roughly 165 to 135 BC.
Part 4. Escaping the turmoil. The whole region was just totally torn apart. Political assassinations, religious compromise, brutal warfare, this all just became the new normal. And this chaos didn't stop with the Maccabees, it kept right on rolling through to the eventual Roman intervention. It really created a perfect, terrifying storm. For a group of people completely obsessed with absolute purity and strict adherence to the law, mainstream society had essentially become fundamentally broken. It was too corrupted to save.
And this brilliantly illustrates the stark, honestly powerful contrast that defined their entire existence. On one side, you have the world outside, a landscape just scarred by warfare, political assassinations, forced cultural assimilation, absolute chaos. And then, on the other side, you have the world they built inside Qumran. Absolute silence, intense daily purity rituals, strict asceticism, and this quiet, highly structured wait for the end of times. They didn't just move away into the desert. They literally created an anti-world. When we look at these ancient writings today, we really aren't just looking at dusty old religious texts. We're looking at the survival manual of a community that intentionally walked away from a burning house. Understanding the violent, turbulent history of Judea during those Maccabean and Roman eras perfectly explains the radical aesthetic choices that the Essenes recorded in these very scrolls. They actively chose the harsh hardship of the desert over the deep corruption of the city.
Which leaves us with one final thought to ponder as we wrap up this explainer. Looking back at their grueling lifestyle and the deeply chaotic world they fled, was abandoning a broken society for radical isolation an act of cowardice? Was it just a refusal to stay and fix the world? Or was it the ultimate act of devotion, preserving the pure light of their faith out in the darkness of the desert? I'll leave that one for you to decide. Thank you so much for joining me in uncovering the mysteries of Qumran. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I will see you in the next visual explainer. Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're venturing deep into the unforgiving, rugged landscape near the Dead Sea. Why? Well, we're going to uncover an incredible true crime drama hidden right inside one of history's absolute greatest archaeological discoveries. We're going to look past all the popular myths and piece together the real gritty story of the mysterious Qumran Brotherhood and the explosive texts they left behind.
It's kind of a fascinating question, isn't it? I mean, picture this. If you were going to isolate yourself in a remote desert cave system to prepare for the literal end of the world, what books are you taking with you? We are about to uncover the astonishing contents of a hidden ancient library, a library that was lost to the sands of time for centuries, only to be stumbled upon completely by accident.
Okay, let's dive into this. You might expect a hardcore group like this to just stick to the standard biblical texts, right? But take a look at their actual reading list. Sure, they had the Torah, the prophets, and a beautifully preserved scroll of Isaiah, but they definitely didn't stop there. They heavily favored apocalyptic texts and things we'd now call rejected or hidden, the Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha. They were just obsessed with books like the Book of Enoch, which talks all about angelic rebellions, the Book of Jubilees, and the Genesis Apocryphon. To this sect, these weren't just obscure little myths. This was the foundational, absolute truth of their entire universe.
Now, as you can see here, these fragmented, incredibly delicate texts survive today only because of pure, unbelievable accident. Just imagine being a young Bedouin shepherd named Muhammad ad-Dib. You're wandering the rocky cliffs near the Dead Sea, just looking for a lost goat. You toss a stone into a dark cave opening, hoping to scare the goat out. But instead, smash. You hear the unmistakable sound of shattering pottery. What he found inside were these tall clay jars, and sealed within them were scrolls wrapped up in linen, perfectly preserved for 2,000 years. And among those fragments was something nobody expected to find, a text called the Prayer of Nabonidus. What's absolutely incredible here is the story it actually tells. It describes this great king of Babylon, Nabonidus, who is struck with a severe, agonizing ulcer by the command of God. He suffers for 7 whole years in the city of Timah, until a Jewish prophet finally steps in.
If you know your history, this directly mirrors the famous stories of King Nebuchadnezzar from the book of Daniel. It really shows us how these ancient stories circulated, evolved, and were deeply, deeply studied by this secluded group. Act 2. The Desert Brotherhood. Let's shift gears from what they read to who these people actually were. An intense, highly regimented sect living out in the Qumran caves. So, who exactly were the men reading these scrolls? Well, they were completely cut off from the rest of society, and joining this brotherhood, it wasn't exactly like joining a modern book club. It was a grueling, life-altering commitment. First, you faced a super strict examination of your character. Then, you entered a mandatory 2-year probation period where you were constantly being tested. If you somehow passed all that, you had to surrender absolutely all of your personal property and wealth to the community's inspector. Imagine having to give up your entire bank account just to join a community. This wasn't just voluntary sharing like we see in early Christianity. This was a mandatory, irrevocable transfer of everything you owned. Finally, you swore a terrifying oath of absolute secrecy.
And those oaths? They were quite literally a matter of life and death. Because members swore they would never, ever partake in the food or customs of outsiders, getting expelled from the group was essentially a death sentence. Think about it. If you committed a grave sin and got cast out, your strict vows still bound you. You couldn't accept food from anyone outside the sect. The ancient records actually tell us that, out of pure desperation, expelled members were forced to eat grass. Their bodies would just waste away until they starved, unless the community took pity on them at the very last second. No way, right?
Inside the community, the discipline was just as extreme. They didn't just sit around a campfire chatting casually. No, they had specific camps managed by an inspector, a mabakir. During their meetings, there was a rigid hierarchy. Priests sat first, then the elders, then the rest of the people, all strictly by rank. They had this council of the masses that maintained absolute silent order. You never spoke out of turn, and you absolutely never interrupted another member while they were speaking. It was an environment of total, unyielding control.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how it brings us to Act 3, an ancient rivalry. This is really the climax of the explainer.
Because beneath the mundane copying of ancient texts and the super strict rules, these scrolls actually hide a juicy, ancient political thriller. We're talking a high-stakes rivalry that completely tore their world apart. The texts constantly reference two enigmatic, unnamed figures, using these specific symbolic titles. On one side, we have the teacher of righteousness. He's described as this humble, enlightened guy, the persecuted leader of the sect who claimed God had revealed all hidden mysteries to him. On the exact opposite side stands his arch-nemesis, the wicked priest. The texts describe this man as a corrupt, greedy ruler who betrayed God's covenant for wealth, stole from the poor, and built a city on blood. It's basically a massive historical true crime expose written in real time by the victims.
We actually get to see the climax of this rivalry in the commentary text shown here, the Habakkuk commentary. It details a truly terrifying moment where the wicked priest actually storms the teacher's private desert retreat. And get this, he does it on the Day of Atonement, the holiest day of the year. The wicked priest just shows up in full terrifying authority, trying to confuse them, torment them, and make them stumble right on their sacred day of fasting. So the big question is, what actually happened to the teacher? And this brings up a massive, highly controversial debate among scholars. When these texts were first translated, some scholars, like Dupont Summer, looked at this suffering teacher of righteousness and theorized he was a direct prototype for Jesus. They argued that the text showed the teacher was tortured, crucified, and even expected to resurrect decades before Christianity even existed. As you can imagine, this theory sent absolute shockwaves through the historical and religious communities. But actually, scratch that. Let's look at what the texts really say. The verdict from the overwhelming majority of historians and linguists today is clear. There is actually zero evidence of crucifixion for the teacher in the scrolls. None at all. In fact, the texts seem to indicate the teacher of righteousness died a totally natural death. He was just gathered to his fathers. It was actually the wicked priest who met a terrible, agonizing, violent end. The scrolls state that God delivered the wicked priest into the hands of his enemies, striking him with a bitter, horrifying punishment for his sins. So if the wicked priest was a real person who suffered a terrible fate, who was he? Well, historians have mapped out the clues to identify two prime ancient suspects who fit the profile perfectly. Suspect number 1 is Jonathan Maccabeus, around 160 BC. He started off righteous, but eventually gathered immense wealth, built huge armies, and was ultimately captured and killed by his enemies. Suspect number 2 is Alexander Junius, around 103 BC. This guy was notoriously cruel. He persecuted religious factions without mercy, and he died an agonizing death from a severe fever that ravaged his body for 3 years. The clues in the scrolls map beautifully onto the bloody, chaotic politics of ancient Judea. Ultimately, the Dead Sea Scrolls aren't just dry, dusty religious manuscripts. Not at all. They are the surviving diaries of a deeply committed, highly disciplined brotherhood caught right in the crosshairs of a ruthless political world. They tell a very human story of faith, betrayal, survival, and a bitter rivalry between a humble teacher and a corrupt priest. So I'll leave you with this. Does finding this very real, high-stakes human conflict behind these ancient texts change how you view history? It definitely reminds us that behind every great historical artifact, there are real people who lived, fought, and died for what they believed in. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the past.
All right, welcome back to The Explainer. Today we're going to unroll some of the most fascinating texts ever discovered, the Dead Sea Scrolls. We're going to literally step into the sandals of an initiate living in the incredibly strict, isolated, and frankly, intense Qumran community. If you've ever wondered what it actually took to leave the world behind and join an ancient desert sect totally obsessed with purity and the end of days, well, you are in the exact right place. Get ready, because we're heading straight into the heart of the desert.
Here's our roadmap for today. We're going to cover the grueling initiation process, a day in Qumran, the silent sacred meals, strict law and the inspector, the cosmic war, and finally, waiting for 2 messiahs. Let's dive right in.
Section 1. The grueling initiation process. Think about the most extreme vetting process you can imagine for an elite special ops unit or maybe a highly secretive society. The Qumran community's initiation was just as intense, if not more so, because it demanded a total commitment of your body, your mind, and your soul. You couldn't just casually stroll up and join. Just getting your foot in the door required a brutal multi-year probation. So, in your first year as a candidate, you were handed a small axe and a white garment. But make no mistake, you were still very much treated as an outsider. You were heavily tested on your character and your ability to practice moderation, and you were strictly forbidden from touching the pure communal waters or the food. Now, if you actually managed to pass that, you entered a second phase lasting 2 more years. During this time, you had to hand over absolutely all your personal property to the community. It was kept separate, held in trust basically, while your morals were scrutinized even further. Only in the 4th year, after proving your absolute, unbreakable endurance and loyalty, could you finally be considered a full member.
And when you finally meet it, well, you didn't just get a handshake and a welcome badge. You had to swear a massive, unwavering oath. You were forced to vow, willingly of course, without coercion, that you would fear God, act justly, forever love truth, and passionately hate evil. You had to promise never to harm anyone, to keep the community's secrets at all costs, and this was absolutely crucial, to never abuse your power if you were ever given authority over others. It was a complete rewiring of your identity. You weren't just clicking I agree on some terms and conditions, you were basically signing your soul away.
Moving on to Section 2, a day in Qumran.
So once you swore that oath, your life changed completely. Let's shift our focus to the tactile, grueling daily reality of a fully initiated member of this sect. It's actually wild to think that the specific, minute details of their daily schedules were preserved in ancient texts, wrapped up and hidden away for centuries. The community's rule documents give us this incredibly vivid window into what a typical day was like out there near the harsh, unforgiving shores of the Dead Sea.
Their day was highly regimented. First off, they rose before the sun. Not to worship the sun, mind you, but to offer ancestral prayers at dawn. They spoke absolutely no worldly words before the light broke. Then, it was time for intense, exhausting labor. Everyone worked at their assigned craft or out in the fields until the 5th hour. Sweaty, tired, and covered in the dust of the desert, they would then gather for their purification rituals. That meant plunging into freezing cold water baths in the massive cisterns they had built. Once fully purified, they would put on stark, pure white garments.
Which brings us to Section 3, the silent, sacred meals.
Okay, picture this. You're newly purified, dressed in absolute white, and you transition to the dining hall as if you're stepping into the inner sanctum of a sacred temple. The rules inside this room were bizarrely strict and heavily choreographed. Everyone had to be perfectly clean. They sat down, and then the baker would serve loaves of bread in a very specific order. The cook followed right behind, placing exactly 1 dish in front of each member. But nobody dared take a bite yet. A priest had to stand and bless the food first. So yeah, not exactly a relaxed, casual dinner party. And throughout this entire process, absolute pin-drop silence was maintained. The texts actually note that if a stranger somehow found themselves wandering into this room, the utter silence would have felt like a profound, almost terrifying mystery.
Which leads us to ask, why? Why the extreme silence? What was the point of all this? Well, it all traces back to their total obsession with purity. To them, the outside world was defiled. It was loud and it was chaotic. Silence acted as a barrier. It was a way to maintain order, discipline, and constant, unbroken spiritual focus. It ensured that their sanctuary was literally never polluted by the noise and the sin of the world they had just left behind.
All right, Section 4, Strict Law and the Inspector.
You see, a community this isolated and this intense doesn't just run on good intentions. It requires an incredibly rigid governance structure to keep this highly disciplined society from just completely falling apart in the desert. Enter the Mebakar, the inspector. This was a figure of immense, sweeping power within Qumran. The inspector meticulously managed the wealth, the properties, and the day-to-step behavior of the various camps. If you had a dispute, or if the finances needed auditing, the Mebakar was the absolute authority overseeing the material and practical laws of the community.
But zooming out, above the individual camps was the supreme governing body, the Council of 12. This council, alongside 3 specific priests, served as the ultimate executive and judicial authority. They were the ones who judged matters of law, finalized big decisions, and kept the ideological purity of the sect completely 100% intact.
And honestly, their internal organization brilliantly illustrates just how deeply obsessed they were with order. Inside their meetings, your physical placement in the room and your actual right to speak were totally dictated by an unyielding hierarchy. Priests sat first, then the elders, then the rest of the people according to their specific rank. You spoke only in turn. Interrupting someone during a discussion? Strictly forbidden. Every single interaction was governed by their ancient, rigid class system.
Let's escalate things in Section 5, the Cosmic War.
Because, get this, all of these earthly laws and physical purifications, they weren't just for keeping the camp tidy. The stakes for this community were literally universe-altering. The texts from Qumran reveal a vivid, epic belief in cosmic dualism. They believed that God created 2 distinct spirits that ruled over humanity, the spirit of truth and the spirit of evil. They saw themselves as the children of light, guided by the Prince of Lights, who's often identified with the Archangel Michael, and everyone else in the outside world? Well, they were the children of darkness, wandering in the paths of shadow, completely ruled by the demonic figure Belial.
And for the Qumran community, this wasn't just some poetic metaphor. They were legitimately preparing for a holy war at the end of time. Their strict earthly isolation, the endless purifying cold baths, the rigid discipline, it was all essentially a spiritual boot camp. They fully believed that soon a definitive, apocalyptic battle would take place where they, the children of light, would ultimately purge the entire world of darkness forever.
Which leads us to our final section, Part 6, Waiting for 2 Messiahs. So, when this epic cosmic war finally arrived and the New World Order was established, who exactly did they believe would lead them? Most traditions expect one central figure, right? But Qumran's expectation was highly unique. They actually awaited a prophet alongside 2 distinct messiahs. As you dive into their hierarchy, they expected a royal messiah from the line of David, but crucially, he was subordinate to a priestly messiah descended from Aaron. In their grand visions of the future, when both messiahs attend that ultimate sacred meal we talked about, it is the priest who takes absolute precedence. He is the one who steps forward to bless the bread and wine first. And the crazy part? We know all of this because they meticulously wrote it down. These are the very scripts where these incredible, isolated ascetics carefully copied down their beliefs in the writing halls of Qumran. Day after day, year after year, dedicating their entire existence to preserving these texts, just waiting for the end of the world out by the Dead Sea. This was a tiny, strict, secluded desert sect that deliberately cut itself off from the rest of humanity. Yet somehow, through their intense discipline, their absolute obsession with writing, and the sheer luck of the dry caves they hid their scrolls in, they managed to preserve ideas in texts that echo through millennia directly to us today. It really leaves us to wonder, if a group of desert outcasts writing in caves could fundamentally alter our understanding of history, what other world-shattering secrets are still buried in the sand, just waiting to be unrolled? Thanks for exploring this explainer with me today, and I highly encourage you to keep digging into the incredible legacy of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Catch you next time.
Welcome to today's explainer. Have you ever wondered if the origins of one of the world's biggest religions were just completely misunderstood? Well, today we're putting on our historical investigator hats to unpack a genuinely fascinating debate. We're drawing directly from Chapter 6 of our source text regarding the famous Dead Sea Scrolls and looking at a historical controversy that fundamentally questions the true beginnings of early Christianity. So let's just dive right into this absolutely explosive question that literally rocked the theological world. When scholars first started translating the Dead Sea Scrolls, they noticed some pretty striking parallels between the early Christian movement and the Essenes, which was the strict monastic-style Jewish sect that actually wrote these texts. This led some folks to boldly ask, was the early Christian message actually unique, or was it just an imitation of an isolated desert cult? To get to the bottom of this, our source gives us a really clear roadmap. We'll be looking at 5 key areas: the controversy, the righteous teacher versus Christ, counsels and wealth, the sacred meal, and finally, secrecy versus universality. Section 1, the controversy. Let's look at the claims that started this whole debate. The source highlights that some pretty renowned scholars, specifically Ernest Renan and later on André Dupont-Sommer, made some massive claims. Dupont-Sommer basically argued that early Christianity was, well, a carbon copy of this older desert group. He suggested that Jesus was simply repeating a role that had already been played by a leader at Qumran. He was effectively reducing the entire Christian narrative to a mere continuation of Essene practices. It was a completely scandalous theory at the time. Now, what's so fascinating is that these ancient fragmented texts are the literal foundation for Dupont-Sommer's controversial thesis. He looked at these faded letters and, honestly, extrapolated a massive historical shift. But, as our source points out, when you take a much closer, rigorous look at these exact same artifacts, you start to see some major flaws in this whole copycat theory. Moving on to Section 2, the righteous teacher versus Christ. Right off the bat, the author argues there is a stark contrast between the leaders of both groups. Over at Qumran, the community was led by a figure known as the teacher of righteousness. But, and this is absolutely crucial, the source insists this teacher was definitively a mortal man. No claims of being the ultimate Messiah, nobody prayed to him, and he certainly didn't give his name to the sect. But then you look at Christ. His followers viewed him from the very beginning as divine, the living head of the church, and they literally took his name. They became known as Christians. Now, Dupont-Sommer leaned heavily on documents like the Habakkuk Commentary, which is this ancient prophetic interpretation text. He claimed this specific document proved the Qumran teacher was a resurrected figure, kind of prefiguring Jesus. But other specialists, they strongly push back. They argue that a careful reading absolutely does not support the idea of a divine, resurrected teacher. The evidence just doesn't stretch that far, folks. Okay, Section 3, Councils and Communal Ownership. Did early Christians just steal Qumran's administrative playbook? Well, regarding the famous 12-member council, the author clarifies a really huge functional difference. Yes, both groups liked the number 12, obviously tracing back to the tribes of Israel, but Qumran's council was this permanent bureaucratic board of directors that strictly mandated the inclusion of 3 priests. Early Christians, on the other hand, had the 12 apostles. This was a unique, foundational group, no priest required, and when the apostles passed away, that specific 12-seat council wasn't just perpetually refilled like a corporate board. And if you want to see just how bureaucratic Qumran really was, just look at their rules for communal property. You couldn't just walk up, hand over your money, and join. Oh no, it was a super rigid process. First, initial admission, then a mandatory 2-year probation period. Imagine undergoing a 2-year background check just to give away your life savings. And only after passing all of that were you subjected to a compulsory surrender of all your personal wealth. Contrast that highly rigid process with early Christian accounts. For early Christians, surrendering wealth was an immediate, completely voluntary act of charity to help the needy, just as we see in the biblical accounts. There was no 2-year probation, no compulsory institutional seizure of your assets. The Christian approach was built on immediate, voluntary care for the community, not some strict legalistic timeline. Section 4 brings us to one of the most debated rituals, the truth of the sacred meal. So it turns out that while both groups used bread and wine, the meaning behind them was just worlds apart. The author highlights that Qumran's meals were strict, daily routines blessed by a priest, and they symbolized their hope for a future messianic kingdom. The Christian Eucharist, though, that carried a deeply transformational theology.
It wasn't just a blessed meal. It was viewed as literally uniting the believer with the divine through the body and blood of Christ. And you know what? The Qumran texts contain absolutely nothing resembling that kind of theology.
And finally, Section 5, the core difference, secrecy versus universality. This is where the insights from scholars like Al-Akkad really bring everything into sharp focus. According to his analysis in our source text, the Qumran sect was characterized by this extreme, almost paranoid isolation. They were highly exclusive, they bound their members with severe oaths to keep their doctrines totally secret. They were consumed by rigid literalism, and they essentially fled into the desert because they viewed the material world as entirely corrupt. They were just waiting in those caves for an apocalyptic war between the sons of light and the sons of darkness.
Now think about how fundamentally opposite the early Christian impulse was. Go into all the world and preach the gospel to all creation. Instead of fleeing to a desert cave to hide a secret doctrine, their foundational mandate was explicitly outward-facing. They were commanded to cross borders, go global, and engage directly with the very society that the Essenes had completely run away from.
So the author concludes that this massive shift from a localized, secretive, literalist group to a universal, global faith, it just completely dismantles the whole idea that one was merely a copy of the other. The Qumran community represents a fascinating, albeit rigid, historical dead end. Christianity, conversely, broke free from that literalism to offer a message meant for all humanity. Sure, there are superficial similarities, but the core missions completely and fundamentally opposed. As we wrap up today's explainer, I think it really shows how absolutely vital it is to look past our initial assumptions and actually dig into the evidence. The Dead Sea Scrolls are a magnificent archaeological treasure, for sure. They give us an incredible window into an ancient, strict desert sect, but they are not the secret blueprint for Christianity. And it leaves us with a thrilling question. If we could get this so wrong at first glance, what other secrets are buried in the desert, just waiting to challenge and completely rewrite our view of history? Thanks so much for exploring this with me today.